Hello everyone. Welcome everyone to the channel's Strange Night Podcast. Story 1. The Keeper of the Red Fire. That night was no ordinary Christmas Eve. In western Iceland, where volcanoes slept and ice and snow reigned supreme, the night of December 24th, 1927, was a blinding white fury. Arnie, a young hunter, was lost. He had ventured deep into the highlands following the tracks of an Arctic fox, but now he couldn't distinguish the sky from the ground. Every step was a struggle against the blizzard, and the cold not only seeped into his skin, but froze his very bones. He was about to give up, accepting a painful end in the white snow, when a small blood-red light pierced through the storm. It was an old wooden cabin, almost buried under thick layers of snow. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and a sudden rush of heat enveloped him, like a saving embrace. Inside, the cabin was unexpectedly warm, yet frighteningly silent. The air was thick with the smell of soot, sulfur, and a strange, sickly sweet yet repulsive odor. The warmest spot was a large stone fireplace where a raging red fire burned. That fire was intense, not the flickering light of ordinary dry wood, but a vivid, almost conscious flame. Sitting on a rocking chair next to the fireplace was an old woman. She was gaunt, tall, and her silver hair was tangled like dead roots. Her eyes were deep-set and amber, staring straight at Arnie. She offered no greeting, only one sentence, her voice dry as stones scraping together. "You should not be here this night. But if you are in, you must not leave the firelight, and you absolutely must not fall asleep." Arnie, shivering, begged to stay the night. The old woman agreed reluctantly and continued to stare into the fire. She explained that Christmas Eve was the night when Grilla, the man-eating giantess, and her monstrous Yule cat went hunting, but not for meat. They searched for unprotected souls, the poor who had no new woolen clothing to wear for the holiday. They didn't kill, they stripped away, taking the final layer of human protection, leaving them for the eternal cold. Arnie felt a shiver. He had a thick coat, but it was old and ragged. He looked at the fire, the only thing that offered a sense of safety. Around midnight, when the storm outside began to howl like a ravenous creature, the true horror began. Arnie heard scratching, not the scratching of branches, but the scrape of something with large, sharp claws, dragging itself across the stone roof. The cabin shook. The old woman suddenly leaped up with frightening speed. She didn't look up at the ceiling, but into the fire. "It's here, the Yule cat. It wants my light. It wants your warmth." The growling was deep and guttural, sounding as if it came from the earth itself. Arnie felt as if all the warm air in the room was being sucked out through the cracks. He looked up at the small, snow-covered window. A massive black shadow blocked out all the faint moonlight. It had the shape of a cat, but 10 times larger, and its eyes were burning red like the fire in the hearth. The most terrifying thing for Arnie was the sensation. A bitter cold, but not the cold of winter. It was the feeling of being stripped bare, of being exposed. A silent, wordless voice echoed in his mind, full of longing. The skin, the wool, the protection must be taken. Arnie instinctively backed closer to the fireplace, feeling his own skin tighten as if his clothes were about to be torn from his body. He stared at the old woman, hoping she would do something. The old woman simply muttered ancient words in Icelandic and threw a handful of pale white powder into the flame. The fire flared up, instantly turning the red into a vibrant green. As the green light touched the ceiling, the growling outside stopped. The massive shadow retreated, but not in fear, in disappointment. The old woman turned back to Arnie, her amber eyes reflecting extreme exhaustion. "This fire is a vow. It is not just wood. It is blood, the last warmth I possess. If it goes out, I will not only be taken by it, but my very soul will be turned into thread in Gryla's hands." She never explained why she kept the fire, or whose blood it was. Arnie dared not ask. He stayed awake the rest of the night, staring into the green-red flame, his hands clutching his ragged coat. He heard softer, more persistent scratching, which lasted until the faint gray light of dawn appeared. When the sun rose, the blizzard subsided. The old woman simply pointed to the door, her gaze vacant. "Go. You are spared. Never return. And always wear something new every Christmas Eve." Arnie ran. He didn't look back. When he looked back from a distance, the wooden cabin had vanished, seemingly dissolved into the thick snow. But he knew it wasn't an illusion. Years later, Arnie was still alive. He never lacked warm clothing, especially in December. But every Christmas Eve, when the wind whistled through the door cracks, he felt that bone-chilling cold return, and the feeling of being stripped bare of everything. He always kept a fire blazing in his hearth, and deep down he wondered, what did the old woman throw into the fire that night? Was it the beauty that had been stripped away from another Christmas victim in exchange for his own survival? The whimpering of the Yule cat still haunted him, and Arnie knew for sure that one day, if he fell asleep or the fire went out, it would return to take the only thing he had left, the warmth of his soul. Story 2. The Ghost on the Trans-Siberian Express. In 1995, in Moscow, the Christmas atmosphere, observed on January 7th for the Orthodox Church, but December 24th was a cold transition, was replaced by the rush and the freezing air. Anya, a young medical student, decided to board the legendary Trans-Siberian Express. The journey was a grueling 4 days to return home to celebrate the winter festivals with her family. The third-class carriage was cramped, but much warmer than the icy world outside. As the train began to hurtle through endless frozen birch forests, Anya noticed a man sitting across from her in the corner of the carriage. He was an odd figure. He always wore a thick wool scarf pulled up to his chin, an old fur hat covering his ears, and a faded military coat, almost turning him into a silent statue amidst the noise. The man only spoke when the train passed through the deepest regions of the taiga forest. He introduced himself as Dmitri and began to recount tragic wartime stories of harsh winters and Christmas parcels lost in nameless battles. "You know, Anya," Dmitri said in a hoarse, hacking voice, "the worst thing wasn't the cold, but the thought of knowing the Christmas gift for my daughter was frozen along with her father's last letter. I must find it. Before the dawn of the 25th, I must find my lost possession." Anya felt pity. She assumed he was an old veteran grappling with PTSD, and the lost possession was just a painful memory. On the second night of the journey, December 24th, Anya woke up to a strange moan. It wasn't the sound of the train engine, but a deep, almost inaudible lament. She looked around. Most passengers were asleep, with only the faint light of the corridor shining in. Dmitri was awake. He wasn't sitting in his seat anymore. He was kneeling on the cold train floor, his hands groping, fumbling beneath the seats and in the cracks of the old wooden floorboards. He searched frantically, his hands scraping the wood, "Mr. Dmitri, what are you doing?" Anya asked, her voice trembling. Dmitri turned around. Anya had to stop herself from screaming. His face was no longer the face of a frail, old man. It had turned a strange, grayish blue color, almost translucent under the weak light. His breath had completely vanished. Not a single wisp of vapor escaped his scarf. Instead, an intensely cold aura emanated from him, making her shiver despite the carriage being warm. "I am searching," he whispered, but the sound was like cracking ice. "I must find it. The parcel for my little girl. The Christmas parcel." Anya fearfully reached out, trying to touch his shoulder. The sensation was more horrifying than anything she had ever experienced. When her hand touched Dmitri's shoulder, she felt no flesh, no bone. His hand, beneath the old military coat, disintegrated like cold ash in an instant, leaving only a terrible, burning, cold sensation. Anya withdrew her hand, staring into the empty space where Dmitri had been kneeling. He had vanished, completely gone, leaving nothing but a slight chill lingering in the air. She tried to scream, but no sound could escape her throat. She turned on her reading lamp and huddled, trembling. Things continued. Throughout the rest of that terrifying night, Anya repeatedly saw Dmitri. He wasn't just in his original spot. He appeared at the end of the corridor, standing silently by the window. He walked through the carriage, making no sound, repeating the act of searching under every passenger's seat. Sometimes she saw other passengers shiver in their sleep or let out soft moans. Anya understood that they too were sensing his cold presence. As the train crossed an old bridge, Anya looked out the window. She saw Dmitri's reflection clearly on the frosted glass, and this time he wasn't looking at the floor. He was staring straight at her, his eyes empty and full of despair. "Can you see?" The whisper echoed in her mind, not through her ears. "The cold didn't kill me. The waiting did. She is still waiting. She must know what her father did on his last Christmas Eve." Suddenly, everything became clear to Anya. Dmitri wasn't a veteran. He was the ghost of a soldier who had frozen to death and been lost along this railway line during World War II, along with the single Christmas parcel he was sending to his daughter. And perhaps his soul was trapped on this train forever, compelled to search for the gift that would never arrive, every single Christmas Eve. As the dawn of December 25th began to shine, casting a faint yellow hue over the Siberian landscape, Dmitri's figure started to fade. The lament stopped. The warm light of the sun dispelled the supernatural cold. Anya looked down at the spot where Dmitri had knelt. There, on the scratched wooden floor, she saw a small object, an old brass button etched with a military insignia and a small, cold burn mark where her hand had touched. Anya never forgot that journey. When she finally got home, she didn't dare tell the story. But she kept the button. She knew that Dmitri, the man in the scarf, wasn't malicious. He was merely a tragedy, frozen in time. And she wondered, was this button the piece of lost possession he eternally sought? Or was it just a grim reminder that on the cold Trans-Siberian Railway, every Christmas Eve, desperate souls are still waiting for things that will never come? Story 3. The Vow of St. Nicholas. The De Vries family moved into an old townhouse in Antwerp, Belgium in November 2005. The house boasted beautiful Flanders architecture, but carried an inexplicable gloom and coldness despite modern heating. They wanted an authentic European Christmas. The trouble began with their youngest son, Peter, aged 7. He was the first to sense the strange presence. Peter often spoke to a kind old man he called Sinterklaas. This man was not the cheerful figure from books. He wore a tattered, ancient bishop's robe, a worn mitre hat, and always appeared sorrowful and angry. "Sinterklaas told me I have to keep a secret," Peter whispered to his mother, Katrine. "He says he is waiting for something, a wooden box beneath the floor." Katrine and her husband, Hans, initially dismissed it as a child's imagination. However, when Hans was repairing a termite-eaten section of the living room floorboards, he discovered a clumsily nailed-down plank. Beneath it was a small, old wooden box, exactly as Peter had described. The box was opened on a cold evening in early December, when both the Netherlands and Belgium were preparing for Sinterklaasavond, Sinterklaas Eve, December 5th. Inside, there was no gold or jewels. There was only a tiny fossilized bone fragment and an old parchment scroll written in archaic Dutch. Hans asked a local historian to translate the document. The letter spoke of a benevolent bishop who was falsely accused in the 17th century of theft and blasphemy. He was imprisoned right in this house, which was once a small monastery, and died in agony, unvindicated. The most terrifying part was the vow recorded at the end of the letter. "Because I am condemned and buried without honor, I swear that no Christmas joy shall ever find this house until my truth is exposed. I shall return, not as the giver, but as the punisher of those who can find me. Every Sinterklaas season I shall knock." They realized that the spirit Pieter saw was not the kind St. Nicholas, but the vengeful soul of the cursed bishop, masquerading as Sinterklaas to claim justice. In the following days, the paranormal events escalated. The wooden box vanished. Decorations, especially shoes and stockings, where children placed gifts on Sinterklaas Eve, were constantly torn or thrown into the fireplace. The night of December 5th, Sinterklaasavond, was the climax. Hans and Katrine were awakened by horrific sounds emanating from the attic. It was the heavy dragging of chains and the sharp whipping sound of a rod, sounds associated with the traditional figure of Zwarte Piet, Black Peter, Sinterklaas' punishing attendant. They suspected a break-in and called the police. When the police arrived, they found no one, but the entire house was covered in a strange black dirt and ash. On the living room ceiling, near the tear from the missing wooden box, a message was scrawled in some dark liquid. "You are the naughtiest." Pieter, their son, sat silently in the corner, his face terrified. "He is angry," the boy whispered, pointing to an old, ripped burlap sack that had appeared beside the fireplace. "He says he found those who lied, and they will be taken away." Inside the sack, Katrine found no candy or gifts. It was an old wicker switch and a small piece of partially burned parchment, bearing the names of Hans and Katrine themselves, and a date. Until Christmas, December 25th. They realized that this vengeful spirit had misunderstood them. It wasn't just seeking the wicked. It was seeking anyone inhabiting this house to avenge its own loneliness and injustice. Its presence had corrupted Sinterklaas into a personal, punishing demon. Hans and Katrine decided to flee the house immediately. They abandoned all their belongings, save for basic suitcases. As they drove away into the cold night, passing through streets glittering with Christmas lights, they looked back at the house. On the attic balcony, supposed to be the safest place, they saw a tall, dark silhouette wearing the old red robe, looking down. It was not the benevolent image of Sinterklaas, but a gaunt, lanky ghost wearing the torn bishop's hat and holding a wicker rod. The ghost did nothing. It just stood there, watching their car drive away. They never returned to Antwerp, but every Christmas Eve, they would hear a knock at the door. Knock, knock, knock. Exactly 3 sounds, echoing, chillingly cold. No one was ever there when they opened the door. They knew it was their cursed Saint Nicholas, bound by his oath of vengeance. And every year you would return to remind them that, in that old house, the joy of Christmas had been replaced by an eternal sentence. And they wondered, was the wooden box and the tiny bone the key to his release? Or had the vow condemned Sinterklaas to remain forever the lonely punisher until his own final judgment day? Story 4. The Snow Eater. December 2018. 4 college friends decided on an adventurous white Christmas trip. They flew to Anchorage, Alaska, and rented a remote cabin far from any settlement. Their goal? To experience the absolute silence of the icy wilderness on Christmas Eve. Before venturing deep into the woods, a local indigenous resident who rented them snowmobiles issued a strict warning. You are entering forgotten land. Don't stray too far from the cabin. Don't waste firewood. And most importantly, never build a snowman. He offered no further explanation, only mentioning that there were ancient spirits in this area. Not the Wendigo, but something worse. Something known as Kalupalik in Inuit lore. Entities that didn't just crave flesh, but craved the warmth of life. On the night of December 24th, heavy snow fell. The temperature dropped to dangerous levels. They huddled around the fireplace, trying to keep their spirits up. However, one of them, Mike, a perpetual challenger, decided to mock the warning. "Look at this," Mike grinned. "A perfect Christmas snowman." He spent an hour creating a tall snowman, even topping it with his wool hat and giving it a red scarf. Afterwards, they went inside and drank to forget the cold. Around 3 a.m., Rachel woke up to a strange noise. The cabin door was securely locked, but she heard a soft scraping and grinding sound, almost like snow being packed together. She looked out the window. Mike was gone. His clothes and snow boots were still by the door. Only Mike had vanished. Rachel woke up the other 2, Sam and Chloe. They searched the cabin, but to no avail. They decided to wait until morning. On Christmas morning, the snow was still lightly falling. They went outside and saw Mike's footprints leading straight into the forest. But next to those footprints, there were other strange marks. Long, S-shaped slides, unlike any animal or human tracks. When they reached the snowman, Sam screamed. The snowman had changed. It was still standing, but its shape had become more grotesque and lumpy. Mike's wool hat was no longer on its head. Instead, a sharp, gray mass of ice protruded. The snowman's torso was deeply indented, as if someone had scooped out a large amount of snow from within. "It's gotten bigger," Chloe stammered, backing away. "It took something to fill itself." In a panic, Sam and Rachel started blaming each other. They had succumbed to the primal fear of the wilderness, where survival hinges on suspicion. Suddenly, Chloe pointed to something half buried in the snow near the snowman. It was Mike's red scarf. But it wasn't just the scarf. It was frozen into a bizarre shape, as if it had been tightly clenched around something while still wet. And most chillingly, they saw a small, reddish-brown streak of liquid dripping from the scarf onto the white snow. At this moment, they realized the terrible truth behind the locals' warning. The Snow Eater wasn't a flesh-eating monster. It was a demonic entity that used snow and ice as its vessel. It drew the warmth and life from humans to shape and sustain its icy body, turning the victim into a warm core inside the frozen shell. When they returned to the cabin, they saw something even more horrifying. 3 more snowmen stood lined up outside, right next to the original one. They weren't snowmen someone had made. They had formed themselves, but their shapes were even more hideous and twisted, with sharp protuberances and dark hollows. 4 had become 3, but now 4 shapes were lurking outside. That night, the remaining 3 decided to burn everything they could to stay warm. They burned furniture, books, and even some unnecessary clothes. They heard the snow whimpering outside. It wasn't the sound of the wind. It was the sound of the snow melting from the heat and lamenting the loss of energy. In a moment of desperation, Sam looked out and swore he saw one of the snowmen move. It didn't walk on feet. It slid, slowly but determinedly, heading straight toward the cabin door. Rachel, paranoid from lack of sleep and cold, began accusing Sam of knowing about Mike's disappearance and trying to cover it up. She looked at Sam, and in the flickering firelight, his face seemed faintly gray and lifeless, as if a part of his warmth had been drained. Finally, they located the satellite phone. They dialed the emergency number, their voices broken with cold and fear. "We're trapped. There's something outside. It's made of snow. It's coming for us." Mid-call, they heard a loud crash. The back window shattered, but no rock or chunk of ice flew in. Instead, an unbearable wave of frigid cold flooded the room, instantly extinguishing the fire in the hearth. The last light vanished. In the complete darkness, Anya and Sam heard a soft scraping on the wooden floor and the groaning sound of ice. The Snow Eater was inside. It didn't need light. It only needed warmth. The story ends abruptly with a cut-off scream and the crunching sound of something hard and cold breaking. The satellite phone dropped into the snow, and the last recorded sound was the icy shriek of the wind, accompanied by a deep, rumbling laugh, like an avalanche. Story 5. The Old Temple Bell Song. The night of December 24th, 1985. Although Christmas is not a major traditional holiday in Japan, it is often a night of heavy snowfall in the mountainous regions. And according to certain ancient local legends, it is the time of the crossing between spirits. Kenji, a folklorist from Tokyo, had traveled to the remote Shimane prefecture. He was searching for information about an abandoned Shinto shrine dating back to the Meiji era, which was rumored to have held a secret ceremony in midwinter. The shrine lay deep in the woods, covered in white snow and silence. Kenji found it, an ancient, decaying wooden structure with torii gates that were nearly collapsing. In the dusty main hall, he found what he was looking for: a small, antique brass handbell, placed carefully on a forgotten altar. According to his notes, this bell was used in a ritual called Yobidashi no Kane, the calling bell, which was rung at midnight in winter to mark the moment when the spirits of those who died unfairly were allowed to return briefly to this world to seek salvation. Kenji, driven by a researcher's curiosity, decided to attempt a daring experiment. Exactly at 12 o'clock on Christmas Eve, as heavy snow fell outside, He stood in the cold, trembling shrine hall and raised the bell. He rang it. The bell chimed. The sound was not loud, but it resonated strangely in the silent space. It was a clear, almost too perfect tone. Instantly, the absolute silence shattered, not because of noise, but because of the presence. An inexplicable wave of frigid cold enveloped Kenji, even though the outside air was perhaps warmer. He felt as if a giant invisible wall was standing right behind him. He turned around, slowly. There was no one. But as he looked towards the long, dark corridor of the shrine, where his weak flashlight could not reach, he saw faint silhouettes begin to appear. They were young girls, wearing faded kimonos, with long hair hanging down to obscure their faces. The shadows did not move. They simply stood there, lined up in a row, advancing slowly from the darkness toward the light. And then he heard it. The bell song. It was not the sound of his bell. It was the sound of dozens of other bells, all ringing simultaneously, with a terrifying, perfect, and steady rhythm. Every girl in the corridor was holding an invisible handbell and performing the ritual. They were holding a deadly festival that he had just awakened. Kenji looked down at his hand. The brass bell he held had developed a rusty green hue, and it was so cold it burned his skin. He realized that he hadn't just rung the bell to call them. He had rung the bell to lead their song. As the bell song reached its climax, the ghost girls began to chant a lullaby. They were ancient Japanese lyrics, sad and horrific, speaking of the pain of being forgotten and the longing for release. The girl at the front of the line, the one closest to Kenji, began to approach. When she stepped into the light, Kenji saw her face. It was completely featureless, just a smooth white mask with no eyes, nose, or mouth. She reached out her hand and grasped Kenji's wrist where he held the bell. The cold was like being pierced by frostbite. "Welcome, timekeeper." The voice didn't come from her mouth, but from the ringing of the bell. "You brought us back. Now you must take a turn." Kenji understood the true meaning of the ritual. Marking the time for the spirits to return was not a blessing, it was a swap. A living soul had to ring the bell to buy freedom for a dead soul. He struggled, throwing the bell away. It clattered across the wooden floor and stopped right at the ghost girl's feet. The moment the bell left his hand, the bell song stopped. The overwhelming presence vanished. The shrine was once again swallowed by the snowy silence. Kenji ran. He bolted out of the shrine, not daring to look back. He ran past the decaying torii gates and through the forest. He eventually made it safely back to the town. He never returned to Shimane. However, every Christmas Eve since then, Kenji hears a faint bell chime. It doesn't come from outside. It comes from inside his house, from inside his own head. And most terrifyingly, he began to notice that on cold days, sometimes he looks in the mirror and sees his face slightly blurred, the features seeming to flatten like a smooth white mask. Kenji knows that although he threw the bell away, he has not escaped the ritual. He is still bound, and on one future Christmas Eve, he will fully become the invisible bell ringer, so that one of those lonely spirits can truly find peace. Story 6. The Curse of the Stolen Bread. In 1898, in Dresden, the capital of Saxony, Germany, Christmas was the season of Christstollen, the sweet, powdered sugar-dusted fruit bread, symbolizing the Christ child in swaddling clothes. Johann Keller was a young, ambitious baker. He yearned to win the city's Dresden Stollen competition, an honor that brought fame and fortune. But his Stollen recipe always lacked a little magic. In early, cold December, Johann ventured deep into the rural Erzgebirge region, famous for its legends of witches and dark magic. He sought out a small wooden house where an old woman named Ilara lived. She was rumored to be a herb witch and held ancient, cursed recipes. Johann bribed the old woman with a large sum of silver, pleading with her to sell him the secret to making the greatest Stollen ever. Ilara, with deep black eyes, agreed, but with a chilling warning. This recipe requires sacrifice. You must use the finest ingredients, and most importantly, you must use flour from the seed of the dead.
Johann didn't understand the phrase, but driven by ambition, he asked no further questions. Ilara handed him a package of grayish silver powder and reminded him the ritual must be completed on the night of December 24th, when the snow covers everything. Johann returned to Dresden and got to work. He gathered the finest dried fruits, almonds, and butter. But as he mixed the dough, Ilara's grayish silver powder began to spread a strange odor, the smell of damp earth, sulfur, and something acrid, almost like rotting flesh. On Christmas Eve, the snow fell relentlessly. Johann closed his bakery and began kneading the dough. The moment he poured Ilara's powder into the Stollen dough, strange things began to happen. He heard whispering and moaning emanating from the very mass he was kneading. There were dozens of small voices lamenting and pleading.
The harder Johann kneaded, the more he felt sharp, hard objects scratching his fingers. He tried to ignore it, attributing it to stress and the cold. He put the massive Stollen into the brick oven. When the Stollen was baked and removed, it looked perfect. The powdered sugar topping glittered like fresh snow, and the aroma of butter and dried fruit filled the bakery. This was truly the greatest Stollen he had ever made. However, as Johann went to cut a slice to taste it, a sharp snap rang out. He used his knife to cut a slice. Instead of finding plump raisins and citrus peel, he saw small, grayish-white, hard objects. As he examined them closely, horror washed over him. Inside the Stollen, mixed with the dough and dried fruit, were tiny bone fragments, dried fingernails, and pieces of human teeth. They were perfectly arranged, forming a skeletal structure within the bread. Johann understood. Flour from the seed of the dead was not a rare grain. It was flour made from seeds sown over unmarked graves, over the forgotten remains of people who had starved during harsh winters and were never properly buried. This Stollen was not a bread. It was a soul receptacle, a bread-made tomb. Ilara had sold him not a baking recipe, but a soul-sealing formula. At that moment, he heard a knock at the door. Knock, knock, knock. Johann looked through the window. It wasn't the police or a Christmas customer. Standing outside under the dim street lamp were the faint, gaunt shadows of dozens of people, their faces hollow with hunger, their eyes empty. They said nothing, just stretched out their hands, craving. They were the dead seeds, and they had been summoned by Johann Stollen. Johann tried to burn the bread, but the fire wouldn't catch. He tried to smash it, but the loaf was rock hard. Finally, he used all his strength to throw the Stollen out the window, hurling it directly into the waiting crowd of spirits. The moment the bread hit the ground, the gaunt spirits lunged at it. Not to eat, they just touched it, and instantly they turned into gray dust, dissolving into the white snow. Johann was spared. He had freed them, if only momentarily. But the curse did not end there. Johann won the Stollen competition. His recipe became famous throughout Dresden, and everyone praised his deadly delicious bread. He became rich, but he could never escape his Stollen. Every Christmas Eve, Johann Keller felt an unbearable hunger. Not ordinary hunger, but a deep emptiness, a craving for sustenance, but not food. He looked in the mirror and saw his body growing thinner, more gaunt over time, no matter how much he ate. He realized that by baking the Stollen with souls, he had trapped himself in the eternal starvation of the deceased. The greatest Stalin had brought him fame, but it also brought him a terrible curse. Forever hungry, yet never satisfied, compelled to feel the agony of dozens of souls sealed within his own Christmas bread. Story 7. The Missing Child on the Moonlit Lake. Christmas, 1978. Jerome and Elise, a young Parisian couple, decided to rent a remote wooden chalet in the French Alps for a peaceful and romantic Christmas holiday. They brought their small daughter, Sophie, who was only 3 years old. The chalet was situated near a small lake which was completely frozen over in winter. Locals had told them a sad legend about the Dame de Glace, the Ice Lady, the spirit of a mother who had lost her child to the cold centuries ago, and every Christmas Eve she would search for a living child to replace her own. On the night of December 24th, soft snow fell, creating a perfect fairy tale scene. After dinner, Jerome and Elise put Sophie to sleep in the cozy attic room near the fireplace. They woke up at 2 a.m. to complete silence. The fireplace had gone out. The house was freezing cold. But what truly horrified them was the empty attic bed. Sophie was gone. The front door was locked from the inside. The windows were too high and showed no sign of forced entry. Her toys were scattered on the floor, but Sophie's thickest coat was still hanging on the hook. Jerome and Elise frantically searched. They called the local police. The police arrived, and after several hours of searching in the snow, they found tracks. Just outside the porch, there were tiny footprints, only in socks, leading directly out into the icy wilderness. And those footprints, untouched by any new snowfall, seemed to be light as a feather on the old snow base. All the tracks led to one place, the nearby frozen lake. Upon reaching the lake, the police pointed to a spot on the thick ice. Jerome saw a small red object, partially frozen into a thinner sheet of ice near the shore. It was Sophie's red wool hat. The seasoned police officer looked at the couple with pain in his eyes. This is where the Ice Lady takes children. She doesn't drag them away. She calls them. She sings a lullaby that only young, innocent children can hear and follow. Jerome was desperate. He looked at the ice. The moonlight shining through made it almost translucent. He swore he could faintly see the shape of the wool hat trapped just beneath the surface. Jerome grabbed a large rock and decided to smash the ice. Elise screamed, trying to stop him. He slammed the rock down. Crack! A sharp, piercing sound. The ice fractured. Jerome looked down into the hole. He did not see his daughter. Instead, he saw a pair of eyes. large, round eyes, glittering with an icy blue light, staring up from the dark water below. They were not Sophie's eyes. They were larger, colder, and filled with ancient emptiness. And then he heard it. A soft, gentle lullaby drifted up from beneath the lake's surface. It was a sweet melody, yet bone-chillingly cold. Not the lullaby of a normal mother. It was a song of silence, of eternal sleep, and of never having to grow up. Sleep, little one. You'll never be cold again. Mama will keep you forever. You'll never cry again. The spirit of the Dame de Glace was there, comforting a child who would never grow up, with her voice and her coldness. Jerome recoiled, terrified. He felt as if those icy eyes were pulling him down, inviting him to join their cold slumber. The police officer finally pulled him away. They cordoned off the area and continued the search for Sophie in the following days. They never found her. A week later, Jerome and Elise left the chalet, left the Alps. They carried with them a grief that was permanently frozen in their souls. However, the story did not end there. Every Christmas Eve, no matter where they were, Jerome and Elise would hear a strange sound outside. It was the sound of ice cracking and small crunching noises, as if someone was walking on frozen snow. And the most horrific thing, sometimes, when Elise would sing another child to sleep, she had another child later. She would hear a second voice, the lullaby of the Dame de Glace, blending into her own, encouraging her to sing of coldness and death. They knew that Sophie wasn't just lost. She had been turned into the Ice Lady's eternally frozen child to fill her emptiness. And the Dame de Glace's spirit, awakened by the cry of a child on Christmas Eve, would always seek to pull the living beneath the cold ice to share her solitude. They no longer saw Christmas as a holiday. It was a warning. Keep your children warm, and be sure you never listen to the lullaby echoing from any frozen lake beneath the winter moon. Story 8. The Returned Letter to Krampus. In 2008, in a small ancient village in Salzburg, Austria, 12-year-old Lucas was having a terrible Christmas season. He was the victim of incessant bullying at school, while everyone else eagerly awaited the Krampuslauf, Krampus Run, festival, and St. Nicholas Day, December 5th. Lucas only felt injustice. Lucas had always heard that Krampus was the demon who accompanied St. Nicholas to punish naughty children with a birch rod and drag them into his sack to take them to hell. On the night of December 4th, Krampus knocked Eve. Lucas sat alone in his room, writing a letter. It was not a gift list for Santa Claus. This letter was addressed to Krampus. Dear Krampus, he wrote in shaky, vengeful handwriting, I don't need gifts. I need punishment. There are 3 classmates who have made my life miserable. I am a good child, but they are the truly naughty ones. Come, punish them. I beg you. Lucas sealed the letter in a black envelope and placed it outside his bedroom window, where a legend said night spirits could receive messages. The next morning, the letter was gone. Lucas felt relief, but also fear. He thought it was just the wind's doing. However, that day, things began. The first bully, who always hit Lucas, took a strange fall down the stairs at school. It wasn't an ordinary fall. His trousers were ripped into long shreds, as if clawed by something sharp. He insisted no one had pushed him. The second bully, who constantly ridiculed Lucas, woke up with long, bright red whip marks on his back, despite sleeping alone in his room. He was so terrified, he stayed home from school. Lucas felt a dark satisfaction. Krampus had answered. On the night of December 5th, Krampuslauf, Lucas watched from afar. He saw men in Krampus costumes running through the street, but then he started seeing a different shape. A tall black shadow with massive goat horns and glossy black fur lurked in the darkness. It wasn't a costume. It was the real Krampus. He didn't run. He stood silently, staring directly at Lucas through the crowd, and gave a chilling, sneering smile, revealing sharp teeth. Lucas realized that he had completed the task, and now he was demanding a payment. When Lucas returned home, he found an old, heavy burlap sack placed right on his bed. Beside it was a small, singed piece of parchment. Only a single word was written on it in reddish-brown ink. You. Krampus didn't just punish naughty children. He punished all malicious wishes. Lucas, by writing that letter, had become an accomplice, and now he was the next target. That night, Lucas couldn't sleep. He heard the sound of chains dragging outside his corridor and the light tapping of goat hooves on the wooden floor. He saw Krampus in his room. He was tall, standing near the window where Lucas had placed the letter. He wasn't aggressive. He merely observed. Krampus held an old birch rod. He didn't hit Lucas, but only used the rod to gently tap the sack on the boy's bed. You asked for punishment. You received it. Krampus's voice boomed, deep as rolling stones. But now, you have used my power. You are mine. Krampus didn't want to physically harm Lucas. He wanted to take the boy's innocence, turning him into a malevolent soul, a permanent pawn haunted by vengeance. Krampus walked away, leaving the black sack and the birch rod. On Christmas morning, Lucas's parents found the boy huddled in the corner, clutching the empty sack. He didn't mention Christmas gifts. Lucas had escaped the bullies, but he was cursed. Since then, Lucas was no longer bullied, but he became obsessed with thoughts of revenge. He constantly sought out others' small faults, and in his mind, he saw Krampus standing behind him, whispering malicious ideas. Every time Lucas felt anger or the desire for retribution, the sack on his bed seemed to grow heavier. And sometimes, in the mirror, Lucas didn't see his own face. He saw burning red eyes and tiny goat horns beginning to sprout from his forehead. Lucas was not taken away by Krampus. Krampus had turned him into his lonely successor, forced to find pleasure in the suffering of others. And Lucas knew that every Krampusnacht he would return, not to punish him, but to thank him for continuing his work. Story 9. The Crypt Beneath the Christmas Shop. In 2020, despite the difficulties of the pandemic, Eleanor and Thomas decided to invest in their dream, opening an exclusive Christmas gift and decoration shop in central London. They leased an old Victorian townhouse located on a secluded, less traveled street. From the moment they took possession in November, they felt something was off. The building was perpetually cold, and a strange scent, like wilting lilies, lingered in the air. As they began decorating in early December, strange phenomena began. Every morning, Eleanor would find decorations shifted. Wreaths and angel figures were rearranged into bizarre shapes, almost like ancient signs or symbols. Strands of fairy lights were often cut, and small silver bells frequently fell, clattering in the quiet night. Initially, Thomas blamed mice, but then they started hearing sounds. Faint, weak coughing and soft sobbing coming from beneath the wooden floorboards on the ground level. When they tore down an old wall in the storage room, they found a small oak door, locked with a rusty padlock. After breaking the lock, they found a narrow stone staircase leading down into a dark basement. Down there, they discovered a forgotten crypt. The room was cold, damp, filled with cracked stone slabs and unnamed stone tombs. It was the burial vault of a church that had been destroyed during the Great Fire of London. Eleanor found the smallest tombstone lying face down. When she flipped it over, she saw a roughly carved inscription. Here rests the nameless soul, died of the plague, hastily buried without ritual, 1665. Pray for our release. A local historian confirmed that their building was erected over a mass burial site for the victims of the Great Plague of London in 1665. The deceased were interred in haste, without final rites, and their souls were believed to be trapped. And now, the joyful Christmas atmosphere, the bright lights, and the cheerful songs had awakened them. As Christmas Eve approached, the spirits grew more aggressive. The coughing and moaning now turned into desperate screams. The shop windows began to be covered with a thick layer of internal mist, as if someone was breathing onto them from the inside. On the night of December 24th, Thomas and Eleanor decided to stay at the shop to prepare for the grand opening. Around 1 a.m., as Thomas was rearranging gifts, all the electric lights suddenly cut out. The room plunged into total darkness, illuminated only by the faint glow of decorative candles. They heard the distinct sound of a funeral rite taking place beneath their floor. Church bells rang jarringly, and a priest's voice mumbled old prayers, but all distorted, as if spoken with a dry, cracked tongue. Then they heard fierce shoving and clawing coming from the crypt.
"They're trying to get out,"
Eleanor whispered, clutching Thomas tightly.
"They want to join the celebration. They want rest."
Just then, a terrifying event occurred. One of the Christmas stockings hanging by the fireplace suddenly bulged, as if an invisible hand had grasped it from the inside. The stocking fell to the floor. As it fell, they saw a tall, lanky shadow standing right next to the Christmas tree. The ghost had no face, but it radiated a bone-chilling cold and the intense scent of wilting lilies. It didn't want to harm them physically. It only wanted the Christmas light. The ghost reached out and touched a string of twinkling lights. Instantly, the lights went dark and let out a hiss. Then it touched a box of chocolates. The box fell, and all the chocolates inside were turned to black ash. The trapped soul could not bear the joy of Christmas. It was trying to destroy every sign of life and happiness to match its own eternal misery. Jerome and Elise fled, rushing out of the store, leaving everything behind in darkness and cold. They never returned. Their exclusive Christmas shop remained permanently closed on December 25th. However, the story does not end. Every time they see Christmas lights or hear the faint jingle of bells, they feel a deep chill sweep over them. And they know that the nameless souls of London, those who died without final prayers, are still seeking release by extinguishing the Christmas joy of anyone who dares to open a shop on their graves. The crypt beneath the Christmas shop was never sealed again, and those spirits are still waiting, beneath London's glittering Christmas lights, to be awakened once more and to turn happiness into sorrow. Story 10. The Talking Pine Tree Christmas, 2023. The setting is a remote rural area in Oaxaca, Mexico, where the tradition of Las Posadas, the procession commemorating Mary and Joseph's journey, is still strong. The Rojas family was preparing for Christmas. The parents, Ricardo and Elena, along with their two young children, Miguel and Sofia. They decided to buy a large, beautiful, real pine tree to set the festive mood. They encountered a strange street vendor, an older man with deep black eyes, who had a tall, perfect, lush green pine tree that stood out from all the others. The vendor insisted that the tree needed special care. "This tree is very thirsty. You must water it with cold spring water exactly at midnight. You must not let it dry out." He charged an exorbitant price and left without further explanation. Ricardo and Elena decorated the tree. It was truly magnificent, glittering with strands of lights and dozens of glass ornaments. However, on the very first night, Miguel and Sofia started hearing strange things. Whispering. It wasn't the sound of the wind. It was dry, rustling whispers emanating from the pine needles. Initially, they spoke in an old form of Spanish, but then shifted to a language that sounded like Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs. "Release me. Release me. The sleeping children." Ricardo initially dismissed it as insects or the heating system, but on the night of December 24th, Posadas Eve, when everyone in the house was asleep, the whispers grew louder and clearer. Elena woke up and went downstairs to the living room. She found Miguel huddled next to the tree. "Miguel, what are you doing?" "Mama," Miguel whispered, pointing at the tree. "It says that spirits are trapped in the ornaments. It told me to take them off." Elena shivered. She looked at the tree. In the faint light, the tree seemed to gently sway, and its shape looked slightly distorted, the sharp green needles resembling fangs. As Elena approached, she saw a terrifying truth. The glass Christmas ornaments hanging on the tree were not ordinary decorations. They were ancient, hand-blown spheres, and inside each one, she swore she could see a small, faint wisp of smoke trying to escape. She touched an ornament. It was unnaturally cold, like ice, and she heard a silent scream echo in her head. She remembered the vendor's words, "Water it with cold spring water." Elena suddenly understood. This pine tree was no ordinary tree. It was the vessel for an ancient entidad, bound by an Aztec ritual. Perhaps a spirit trapped within sacred pines to prevent it from harming others. The glittering ornaments were not decorations. They were small spirit traps, placed to keep the entidad inside from escaping. And the cold spring water was the necessary liquid to maintain the seal. Just then, she heard a loud crack from the base of the tree. Ricardo had forgotten to water the tree tonight. The tree was drying out. The seal was breaking. The pine tree began to come alive. The branches stretched out, slowly but decisively. The glass ornaments began to shatter spontaneously. Each time an ornament broke, a small wisp of black smoke escaped and dissolved into the air. But they weren't finding peace. They were feeding the tree power. The whispers now transformed into a fierce, non-human growl. "I am free. All light, all warmth is mine." The tree didn't just want to escape. It wanted to consume the joy and light of Christmas. Elena grabbed Miguel, trying to run. As they passed the tree, a branch whipped out fiercely, wrapping around Miguel's pajamas. Elena pulled the boy free. The pajamas were torn, and on Miguel's skin there were deep, Y-shaped scratch marks, as if made by needles. They fled outside, into the cold night. They ran to a neighbor's house, screaming for help. When they looked back at their own house, what they saw was not a Christmas tree. It was a tall, black silhouette moving in the shimmering light of the remaining decorations. Those lights were not shining. They were being sucked into the tree and then going dark. On Christmas morning, the police investigated. The Rojas house looked completely normal, except for one thing. All the light was gone. Every light bulb was burnt out. Even the sun seemed weaker. The Christmas tree stood in the middle of the living room, now just a dry husk, and all the ornaments were shattered. The Rojas family could never feel the joy of Christmas again. They realized that the tree had eaten all the light, joy, and warmth they had poured into the holiday. It had returned to its sealed state, but it had taken their spiritual warmth with it. And more horrifyingly, Miguel, the boy who had touched the tree, occasionally looked at the plants in the garden and saw them gently shaking, whispering in the ancient language. He knew he was still connected. The talking pine tree was a final warning. In places where ancient and modern cultures intersect, not everything that glitters is a gift. Sometimes the most beautiful thing is the most terrifying soul trap.